The Terran Collective stretched across 17 star systems like a particularly ambitious spiderweb. If spiders had developed faster than light travel and a disturbing fondness for orbital defense platforms. Their territory sprawled from the mineral-rich Kepler belt to the exotic matter farms of Proxima Centauri, encompassing roughly 12 trillion souls who had never heard the word human spoken as anything other than a punchline, which was, admittedly, hilarious. The Collective's capital world of New Vesperia buzzed with the kind of interstellar commerce that made economists weep tears of joy. Crystalline Zephyrians haggled over quantum processors with silicon-based mechanoids, while gaseous nebulons drifted through marketplace corridors, literally absorbing the atmosphere of competitive capitalism. Trade routes hummed with cargo vessels carrying everything from synthesized emotions to weaponized mathematics. All of it flowing through a civilization that had convinced itself it was the pinnacle of galactic evolution. They were wrong, of course, but nobody had bothered to tell them. In the prestigious halls of the Xenoarchaeological Institute, Professor Clix-9 adjusted his optical sensors and prepared to deliver his weekly lecture on extinct species and their mythological representation. The insectoid academic had built his entire career on the study of dead civilizations, and his favorite subject was the delightfully ridiculous concept of human. Now, class, he chittered, his mandibles clicking with academic authority, we come to one of the most persistent myths in galactic folklore. The so-called humans of the third planet in the Sol system. A holographic display materialized, showing a blue-green world that looked suspiciously like a vacation brochure. These bipedal mammals allegedly possessed remarkable adaptability and an unfortunate tendency towards self-destruction. A young crystalline student raised a translucent appendage. Professor, why do the myths always describe them as so aggressive? Clix-9's antennae twitched with amusement. Primitive species often projected their fears onto imaginary bogeymen. The human myths describe creatures capable of surviving in environments that would kill most civilized beings, possessed of something called stubbornness that apparently bordered on the psychotic. The class rippled with laughter. They were said to pack bond with anything that moved, and several things that didn't. What made the professor's lecture particularly entertaining was how thoroughly the galactic community had bought into their own revisionist history. Somewhere along the way, the Sol system had been catalogued as a failed experiment in planetary development. The third planet, designated as a Class M wasteland with excessive geological activity, had been written off as uninhabitable approximately 3 centuries ago by a survey team that had apparently confused pre-industrial civilization with complete extinction. The mistake had been compounded by the Collective's rather impressive bureaucracy, which had filed the Sol system under cautionary tales rather than active monitoring. The error had snowballed through generations of record-keeping, transforming living humans into mythological humans, then into extinct humans, and finally into the current status of humans never existed in the first place. But aren't the stories amusing? On the mining world of Kepler 422b, Shift Supervisor Vex Prime entertained her workers with particularly colorful human folklore during break periods. And then, she would boom, her rocky exterior crackling with mirth. The humans supposedly invented something called caffeine addiction, and used it to power their entire civilization. The assembled miners would dissolve into whatever passed for laughter among their various species. The joke was on them, naturally. While the Collective's finest minds debated the mythological significance of human coffee culture, actual humans were busy expanding their own sphere of influence at a rate that would have impressed even the most optimistic xenosociologists. The real Sol system hosted a thriving civilization of 8 billion beings, who had somehow managed to achieve interstellar travel without joining the Galactic Communications Network, mostly because they had never bothered to check if anyone was listening. Earth's orbital infrastructure alone would have made the Collective's engineers weep with envy, assuming they had known it existed. Massive space elevators stretched into the void, connected to mining platforms that harvested asteroids with the kind of efficient brutality that would have made the mechanoids recalculate their own productivity metric. The humans had even established colonies on 17 worlds of their own, a fact that would have struck the Collective as either deeply ironic or profoundly embarrassing, depending on their individual sense of humor. But the most delicious irony was how the galactic community had managed to mythologize a species that was at that very moment probably having arguments about whether alien civilizations were real or just elaborate hoaxes perpetrated by their own government. Some myths, apparently, were more mutual than others. The mining vessel, profitable venture, had been christened by a Ferengi accountant with all the poetic sensibility of a tax audit, which made it perfectly suited for the unglamorous work of strip mining asteroid fields in the unfashionable outer rim of explored space. Captain Zorkai, a four-armed Nexarian with the personality of burnt toast, had been running deep space extraction operations for the better part of 2 decades without encountering anything more exciting than a particularly stubborn chunk of platinum, which was exactly why the universe decided to ruin his day. "Captain," chirped Navigation Officer Pip-12, her mechanical voice carrying just enough uncertainty to make Zorkai's stomachs clench. "We're detecting an anomalous signal from grid reference 7. Zorkai's primary arms continued operating the mining controls while his secondary arms reached for his caffeine substitute. "Define anomalous, Pip. Are we talking mildly interesting rock formation or giant space monster that wants to eat our ship?" "Neither, sir. We're detecting what appears to be organized electromagnetic radiation. Structured patterns. Communication arrays." The mechanoid's optical sensors flickered with confusion. From the Sol system, the captain's beverage intake paused mid-sip. "Sol system? Isn't that the dead zone with the mythical whatsamacallits?" "Humans, sir. And according to our database, yes. The system was classified as a failed planetary development with no indigenous life forms above the bacterial level." Zorkai's third stomach chose that moment to remind him why he hated surprises. "Run a full spectrum analysis and check our navigation systems. I'd rather not explain to the insurance company why we got lost and started seeing things." What followed was 30 minutes of increasingly frantic sensor sweeps, each one confirming what the crew desperately wanted to dismiss as equipment malfunction. The Sol system was not only occupied but bustling with the kind of orbital activity that suggested a civilization several centuries into its space age. "Captain," whispered communications specialist Thrum Vex, his gelatinous form quivering with what might have been excitement or terror, "I'm detecting multiple artificial satellites, space stations, and what appears to be industrial infrastructure. Lots of it." The bridge fell silent except for the ambient hum of life support systems, each crew member processing the implications of discovering that their most cherished mythological species was, in fact, aggressively alive and apparently thriving. "How?" Zorkai asked with the careful precision of someone trying not to have a mental breakdown. "Did an entire civilization manage to exist in a system we've had marked as uninhabitable wasteland for 3 centuries? "I'm beginning to suspect," Pip-12 replied with mechanical dry humor, "that our record-keeping might be somewhat flawed." The mining ship's sensors continued their methodical cataloging of impossibility. Massive orbital platforms surrounded the third planet, connected by transport networks that put the Collective's infrastructure to shame. The asteroid belt showed signs of systematic harvesting that would have impressed even the most efficient mechanoid operation. Most disturbing of all, the energy signatures suggested a level of technological development that no primitive species should have achieved. "Sir," Thrumvex's voice had climbed several octaves higher, "I'm detecting what appears to be active scanning from the system. They know we're here." The captain's remaining composure evaporated like atmosphere through a hull breach. "They're scanning us, with what? Our database says they should be throwing rocks at each other. The scans are sophisticated, sir. More advanced than our own passive sensor." Zorkai found himself in the uniquely uncomfortable position of a predator suddenly realizing it had wandered into the territory of something significantly more dangerous. "Set course for the system perimeter. Full stealth mode. And send a priority message to Collective Command." "What should the message say, sir?" The captain stared at the tactical display, watching as several unidentified vessels began moving in their direction, with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military organization. "Tell them we need to update our mythology textbooks, urgently." As the profitable venture retreated to what its crew hoped was a safe distance, automated monitoring stations throughout the Sol system dutifully recorded the encounter. The data flowed through communication networks to defense coordination centers, where human analysts reviewed the footage with the kind of professional interest reserved for discovering that the neighbors had been peeking over the fence. On Luna Base, Defense Coordinator Morrison sipped her coffee and watched the alien mining ship flee toward the outer system. "Well," she remarked to her assistant, "that was anticlimactic. Think we should invite them back for Her assistant, a young lieutenant with the unfortunate habit of taking things seriously, frowned at the display. "Ma'am," Shouldn't we be more concerned about first contact protocols? This is historic. Morrison's laugh carried the weight of someone who had spent decades preparing for this exact scenario. Son, we've been monitoring their communications for 40 years. We know more about their shopping habits than they do. She gestured toward the retreating vessel. The historic part isn't that they found us. It's that they finally figured out we exist. The lieutenant's expression shifted from concern to confusion. Ma'am, the Terran Collective has been broadcasting their entertainment programs, news feeds and academic discussions across half the galaxy. Did you think we hadn't noticed? Morrison's grin carried just enough predatory satisfaction to make her assistant uncomfortable. We've been waiting for them to work up the courage to actually visit. As news of the discovery spread through the Collective's communication networks, emergency sessions convened on New Vesperia. Xenobiologists frantically revised their theories about extinct species, while military strategists tried to calculate the implications of an unknown civilization that had somehow achieved spaceflight without anyone noticing. The irony was lost on none of them except for the fact that it was completely lost on all of them. The emergency session on New Vesperia had all the dignity of a daycare center during a sugar rush. Representatives from 14 different species crowded into the Grand Assembly Hall, each one contributing their own unique brand of panic to what historians would later describe as the great mythological crisis of 20. The same rocky individual who had entertained minors with human folklore now found herself in the supremely awkward position of explaining to the Collective Council why their most beloved cautionary tale had apparently developed faster than light travel and a disturbing fondness for orbital defense platform. The situation, she began, her crystalline voice cracking slightly, is somewhat more complex than initially anticipated. Representative Clicks-9 waved his antennae frantically. Complex. Chancellor, we've built our entire xenoarchaeological curriculum around the assumption that humans were a primitive species that destroyed themselves. I've written 17 papers on their mythological significance. Perhaps, suggested Counselor Nix Theta with the kind of diplomatic delicacy that came from centuries of practice, we should consider the possibility that our historical records contain minor inaccuracy. The understatement of the millennium hung in the air like a particularly awkward dinner guest. What they couldn't know was that at that very moment, the humans were having their own emergency session. The difference was that theirs involved significantly more laughter and considerably better coffee. The Terran Defense Council convened in a conference room that overlooked Earth's orbital shipyards, where the latest generation of exploration vessels were being fitted with what human engineers cheerfully called diplomatic enhancement packages. The term was bureaucratic nonsense that roughly translated to enough firepower to glass a small moon, but tastefully concealed. Admiral Chen leaned back in her chair, reviewing the intelligence reports with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from decades of contingency planning. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a problem. The Terran Collective has discovered we exist. The room erupted in what could charitably be called discussion, though it bore a stronger resemblance to a pack of wolves arguing over hunting territory. About time, muttered General Rodriguez, his cybernetic implants flickering with amusement. I was starting to think they'd never work up the courage to visit. The question, interjected Dr. Patel, head of the Xenological Research Division, is how we respond. Do we pretend to be primitive? Do we reveal our true capabilities? Do we invite them for dinner and see if they're edible? Admiral Chen's smile carried the weight of someone who had spent considerable time preparing for this exact scenario. We do what humans do best. We improvise, adapt and probably confuse everyone involved, including ourselves. The plan that emerged was beautiful in its simplicity and terrifying in its implication. Rather than wait for the Collective to send a formal diplomatic mission, the humans would make first contact on their own terms. 3 days later, the Terran exploration vessel Reasonable Discourse dropped out of hyperspace directly above New Vesperia, its arrival time to coincide with the morning rush hour for maximum psychological impact. The ship itself was a masterpiece of human engineering philosophy, sleek enough to suggest advanced technology, armed enough to discourage hostility, and named with the kind of dry humor that had characterized human diplomacy since the invention of passive-aggressive treaty negotiation. The ship's captain, a woman whose personnel file listed her hobbies as extreme diplomatic solutions, and making aliens question their life choices, opened communications with the kind of casual professionalism that suggested dropping unannounced into foreign star systems was a routine Tuesday morning activity. New Vesperia Traffic Control. This is Captain Taylor of the Terran vessel Reasonable Disc. We understand you've been having some interesting discussions about our existence. We thought we'd drop by to clear up any confusion. The silence that followed was the kind of perfect quiet that preceded either diplomatic breakthroughs or spectacular military disaster. Traffic Control Coordinator Zimvex, a mechanoid whose programming had never included protocols for handling mythological species, found himself in the unique position of needing to grant landing permission to beings that, according to his database, had never evolved in the first place. Terran vessel, he managed, his voice carrying the electronic equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Please state your existence status. We're reasonably confident we exist, Captain Taylor replied with the kind of deadpan delivery that had made human diplomats legendary throughout their own space. Though we're open to philosophical discussions on the nature of reality if you prefer. The conversation that followed would be studied in diplomatic academies for centuries, primarily as an example of how to completely upend established galactic order while maintaining impeccable politeness. Within 6 hours, the reasonable discourse had been granted diplomatic immunity, temporary orbital parking, and an emergency session with the Collective Council. The humans had also managed to negotiate favorable trade agreements, establish preliminary cultural exchange programs, and accidentally start a philosophical crisis among 3 different species regarding the nature of existence itself. Chancellor Vex Prime, now faced with the practical reality of greeting beings she had previously dismissed as folklore, found herself preparing for what would either be the most important diplomatic meeting in galactic history, or the most elaborate practical joke ever conceived. So, she asked her aide, a young crystalline with the unfortunate job of rewriting the entire diplomatic protocol manual, what exactly does one serve mythological beings for lunch? The aide's response was lost in the general chaos of a civilization, realizing that their understanding of the universe had just been reduced to the intellectual equivalent of a children's picture book. Meanwhile, the humans waited patiently in orbit, probably discussing the weather and wondering if alien food was any good. Some myths, it seemed, were significantly more problematic than others. 6 months after what historians euphemistically termed the Great Existential Clarification, the galaxy had settled into a new normal that bore approximately as much resemblance to the old normal as a supernova bears to a birthday candle. The Terran embassy on New Vesperia had become the most popular destination for xenosociologists, philosophers, and tourists who wanted to gawk at living legends. The building itself was a masterpiece of human architectural philosophy, functional enough to serve diplomatic purposes, impressive enough to suggest advanced engineering, and designed with enough subtle defensive features to discourage the kind of enthusiastic visitors who might arrive with hostile intention. Ambassador Martinez, a woman whose diplomatic credentials included successfully negotiated peace between 3 warring species using only coffee and creative profanity, held court in her office while reviewing the morning's intelligence report. The galaxy, she had discovered, was significantly more entertaining when viewed from the perspective of beings who had spent centuries being dismissed as children's stories. The latest update from the Xenoarchaeological Institute, her aide reported with barely concealed amusement, is that Professor Clicks-9 has suffered what his colleagues are calling an academic identity crisis. Apparently he's been drinking heavily and muttering about the fundamental unreliability of the fossil record. Martinez's laughter carried the weight of someone who had spent decades preparing for precisely this kind of diplomatic chaos. Send him a bottle of our finest whiskey with a note saying, "Welcome to the universe being more complicated than you thought." It's a very human experience. The transformation of galactic society had been swift and comprehensive. The Collective's educational system had undergone what administrators carefully termed comprehensive curriculum revision, though the actual process bore a stronger resemblance to intellectual demolition followed by frantic reconstruction. Textbooks that had spent centuries describing humans as cautionary folklore were hastily recalled and replaced with editions that featured the decidedly awkward disclaimer, "Recent evidence suggests this species may be more extant than previously believed." Trade had exploded between human and collective space, driven partly by genuine economic opportunity and partly by the galaxy's burning curiosity about beings who had somehow achieved interstellar civilization while remaining completely invisible to their neighbor. Human coffee had become the most sought-after commodity in 14-star systems, though the collective scientists were still struggling to understand why a simple stimulant had become the foundation of an entire civilization's productivity. Their entire economic system, reported Velkix to the Collective Science Council, appears to be based on the systematic consumption of a mildly addictive plant extract. They've somehow managed to build faster-than-light travel around the logistics of coffee distribution. The irony was not lost on human economists, who had spent decades explaining to their own governments that their infrastructure investments were driven by strategic necessity rather than caffeine addiction. The fact that alien researchers had identified the truth within weeks of first contact was a source of considerable embarrassment among the Terran economic planning committees. Cultural exchange programs had produced results that no one had anticipated and everyone should have expected. The first group of collective exchange students to visit Earth had returned with what their supervisors diplomatically termed profound philosophical adjustment. The students themselves described their experience as discovering that the universe has a sense of humor and it's significantly darker than anyone expected. The most successful exchange had been between human comedians and collective entertainment specialists, who had discovered that the fundamental absurdity of existence translated remarkably well across species barriers. The galaxy's most popular entertainment program was now a variety show hosted by a human comedian and a crystalline philosopher, whose discussions of everyday life had somehow become the foundation for a new school of existential comedy. The thing about discovering you're mythological, the human host had explained to his crystalline co-host during a particularly popular episode, is that it makes you question whether anything else you believe is actually real. For instance, I'm now wondering if my tax bills are just elaborate fiction. From a purely logical standpoint, his co-host had replied, the existence of taxation suggests a level of bureaucratic sophistication that exceeds most mythological frameworks. Your tax bills are probably more real than you are. The audience had found this exchange hilarious, though for entirely different reasons depending on their species' understanding of metaphysical comedy. Military cooperation had proceeded with the kind of cautious enthusiasm that characterized interactions between civilizations that had accidentally discovered they were roughly equal in terms of technological development, and significantly different in terms of tactical philosophy. The collective's military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force applied through careful planning and superior logistics. Human military doctrine emphasized creative problem-solving, adaptive tactics, and what their allies had learned to recognize as aggressively improvised solutions to problems that shouldn't technically be solvable. The joint training exercises had been educational for everyone involved, though the collective's officers were still processing the psychological implications of watching human troops treat impossible scenarios as intellectual puzzles to be solved through application of spite and superior firepower. But perhaps the most significant change had been in the realm of galactic mythology itself. The discovery that humans existed had triggered a comprehensive review of other extinct or mythological species throughout collective space. Archaeological expeditions were being hastily organized to revisit star systems that had been dismissed as uninhabitable, while xenobiologists scrambled to develop new protocols for distinguishing between actually extinct and just really good at avoiding detection. The collective's mythology textbooks were being rewritten with the kind of philosophical humility that came from discovering that their understanding of the universe had been approximately as accurate as a blindfolded dart thrower aiming at a target in another room. Ambassador Martinez reviewed the latest diplomatic correspondence, noting with professional satisfaction that the galaxy had adapted to humanity's existence with the kind of resilient flexibility that suggested most civilizations were probably tougher than they appear. The morning's reports included trade agreements, cultural exchange proposals, and what appeared to be an invitation to participate in a galactic cooking competition. The irony, she mused to her aide, is that we spent centuries wondering if we were alone in the universe, while they spent centuries convinced we didn't exist. Everyone was wrong, and everyone was right, which is probably the most human outcome possible. Her aide, a young diplomat whose training had included courses in advanced interspecies confusion management, nodded thoughtfully. Ma'am, should we be concerned that our existence has caused what appears to be a galaxy-wide philosophical crisis? Martinez's smile carried the weight of someone who had spent decades preparing for precisely this kind of diplomatic opportunity. Son, The universe is a fundamentally absurd place populated by beings who take themselves far too serious. If our existence helps everyone realize that, we've probably done the galaxy a favor. Outside the embassy windows, the traffic patterns of New Vesperia continued their eternal dance, now complicated by the presence of human vessels whose crews were probably having arguments about whether alien food was any good and wondering if they could get decent coffee anywhere in this part of the galaxy. Some myths, it turned out, were significantly more useful when they came with their own diplomatic corps and a disturbing fondness for caffeinated beverages. The universe had become a more interesting place, which was probably what it had been aiming for all along.